Next, former presidential candidate Senator Bernie Sanders. He spoke about the impact of the 2016 elections and took questions from Washington Post columnist E.J. Dionne. This event was hosted by George Washington University. It's about an hour and 15 minutes.
Thank you. Lisa, thank you. Thank you very much. And let me thank all of you for coming out. I can't quite see you, but I understand there are a lot of people out there. So thank you very much for coming. And I look forward to chatting with EJ in a few moments. But before we do, I just wanted to say a few words about the election and where we are today. Because I know there are a lot of people who are frightened, a lot of people who are extremely unhappy, and I would not be telling you the truth if I didn't tell you that Tuesday night was a very, very depressing evening for me. But I want to maybe begin by telling you that as a result of having the privilege and the opportunity of running all over this country, going to 46 states during my campaign, I ended the campaign far, far more optimistic than when I began that campaign. And the reason for that is all over this country, I saw extraordinarily beautiful people, working people, young people who love this country and who are determined to do everything that they can to make the United States of America the kind of nation we know we can become. And the other point that I want to make as we move into the Trump era is to understand that real change and real politics never takes place from the top on down. It always occurs from the bottom on up. And what that means, in my view, is that when millions of people stand together and they refuse to allow demagoguery to divide us up by race, by the country we were born in, by our sexual orientation, when we stand together by the millions, we can stop Mr. Trump or anyone else from doing bad things to this country. So as Lisa just mentioned, what I have always believed is that election days are very, very important days, to be sure. And elections are enormously important. But politics is not just about elections. If you think about our history as a nation and the profound changes that have taken place, what you understand is that change only takes place when millions of people look around them and they say that the status quo is not working and are prepared to fight for social, racial, economic, and environmental justice. So I just want to, in terms of the election, make 3 points. Number one, in case you don't know, and I'm sure most of you do, Hillary Clinton ended up winning the popular vote by what we think, after all the votes are counted, by about 2 million votes. Number two, if you are a progressive, on issue after issue, whether it is raising the minimum wage to a living wage, whether it is pay equity for women, whether it is rebuilding our crumbling infrastructure and creating millions of decent-paying jobs, whether it is reforming a broken criminal justice system or a broken immigration system, whether it is making public colleges or universities tuition free, whether it is demanding that the wealthy start paying their fair share of taxes. On all of those issues and more, the American people are on our side. Don't ever forget that. Now, during the course of his campaign, Mr. Trump, and I should tell you that in that campaign, I was as active as I could be. During the last week of that campaign, I was in 12 battleground states, giving 21 speeches at rallies all over this country, because I thought that it was absolutely imperative that we do everything that we can to make sure that Hillary Clinton was elected and not Donald Trump. But it didn't turn out that way. And here is where we are today. It seems to me four things. Number one, five things, who knows? We don't know. During the course of his campaign, which clearly, and we have to acknowledge this, was certainly one of the most unusual campaigns ever run by a candidate, Mr. Trump said a whole lot of things, and sometimes I think they would just come off the top of his head. And toward the end of the campaign, he was actually using a term that many Democrats don't use. He was saying that he was going to be the champion of the American working class. That's what he said. Well, Mr. Trump, we have a list of everything that you said, and we are going to hold you to account. And what I think Mr. Trump did, and this speaks to why I personally believe we need major reforms of the Democratic Party. What Mr. Trump said and talked about is something that the pundits here in Washington have not a clue about, and the corporate media has very little understanding about. And that is that what he understood to be true, and it is true, is despite the fact that today we are far, far better off economically after 8 years of Obama than we were when Bush left office, that is true. There is another reality, and that is that all across this country, there are millions and millions of decent, good people who are frightened about the world that they are living in. There are mothers out there, single moms or young couples, who are making $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 a year. Mom and dad are working. They need child care for their children, and yet child care costs $10,000 or $15,000. How do you afford $15,000 for child care when you're making $40,000 or $50,000 a year? There are workers in my state who see an explosion in technology. They see the very wealthiest people in this country becoming phenomenally richer. They see large corporations enjoying record-breaking profits. And yet they are working not at one job, they're working at two jobs, they are working at three jobs. There are people all over this country who are 55, 60 years of age. They have worked their entire lives, and now they are going to be retiring soon. And you know what? Half of those older workers do not have a nickel in the bank for retirement. There are young people who went deeply into debt, $30,000, $50,000, $80,000 in debt in order to go to college. But when they leave school, they find that the only jobs they can get are jobs which pay them $12, $14 an hour, not enough to repay their debt. That is the reality for millions of people in this country. And that is the reality of a middle class which has been in decline for the last 40 years. That is the reality of 43 million fellow Americans who today are living in poverty, something that we do not talk about at all, not mentioned on television, and some in dire poverty. We are living in a nation which has a grotesque level of income and wealth inequality in which the top 1/10 of 1% now owns almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%. And that is the reality that Mr. Trump perceived to be true. And he said, I hear you are hurting. And I hear and understand you're worried about the future for your kids. And I alone can do something about it. And people voted for him. Now, let me just tell you some of what Mr. Trump talked about. And we're going to hold him accountable. Mr. Trump said, Mr. Trump said, unlike many Republicans, the vast majority of the Republicans, he said, he will not cut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Now, I believe we should expand Social Security. I believe in a Medicare for All program, but that is what he said. And pay attention to see what he now does. The question that will be resolved pretty quickly is whether or not everything that he was saying to the working families of this country was hypocrisy, was dishonest, or whether he was sincere. And we will find that out soon enough. But number one, no cuts, says Mr. Trump, to Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Mr. Trump says he wants to invest $1 trillion in rebuilding our crumbling infrastructure. That is a good sum of money. That is exactly what we should be doing. And we can create millions of good-paying jobs if we do that. Mr. Trump, that's what you said on the campaign trail. That's what we look forward to seeing from you. Now, I happen to believe that the federal minimum wage of $7.25 today is a starvation wage, that it should be raised to $15 an hour, a living wage. Mr. Trump did not say that, but what he did say is we should raise the minimum wage to $10 an hour. Not enough, but a start. And we will hold him to those words. Mr. Trump said that Wall Street, dangerous, doing bad things. He wants to reestablish Glass-Steagall legislation. I look forward to working with him. Mr. Trump said he wants 6 weeks of paid maternity leave. Well, every other major country on earth has, I think, at least 12 weeks of paid family and medical leave, but this is a start. This is a start. We look forward to working with him if he is honest about that. Mr. Trump said throughout his campaign, a cornerstone of his campaign, he wants to change our disastrous trade policies. As somebody who voted against every one of these trade policies, I look forward to working with him to make that happen. So I think what you will see on Capitol Hill is many Democrats will be prepared to work with Mr. Trump if he turns out to be sincere about the promises he made during the campaign. If those promises turn out to be hollow, if they were nothing more than campaign rhetoric, we will not only oppose his economic policies, we will expose that hypocrisy as well. But there is an area where and I think I can speak for virtually every member of the Democratic caucus, will not be working with Mr. Trump. We will not be involved in the expansion of bigotry, of racism, sexism, homophobia. This country, as you all know, since our inception, has struggled to overcome discrimination of all forms. And that is racism and sexism and xenophobia and homophobia. For hundreds of years, extraordinarily brave people have stood up, and some of them have died in the struggle to end discrimination in America. And I say to Mr. Trump from the bottom of my heart, and I know I speak for millions of fellow Americans, Mr. Trump, we are not going backwards in terms of bigotry. We're going to go forward in creating a non-discriminatory society. And in that regard, I call upon Mr. Trump to rescind the appointment that he made of Mr. Bannon a president of the United States should not have a racist at his side. Unacceptable. And there is another area which concerns me very much. And that is, despite virtually all of the scientific evidence, Mr. Trump, throughout his campaign, proclaimed that his view is that climate change is a hoax created, for whatever reason, in China. Couldn't quite figure that out. And I say to Mr. Trump, climate change is not a hoax. It is the great planetary crisis that we face. And that if we do not act boldly to transform our energy system away from fossil fuel to energy efficiency and sustainable energy, the planet that we will be leaving to our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren will be far less healthy and habitable than the one that we have today. And this is an issue in which millions of Americans and people all over the world, this is not an American issue, this is a global issue, because if the United States backs down and gives up on the effort to combat climate change all over the world, China, Russia, India, other countries are going to say, why are we doing it? Why are we transforming our energy system? Look at America, they're not doing it. So millions of us have got to stand up and tell Mr. Trump to read a little bit about science. To start listening to the scientific community and not the CEOs of the fossil fuel industry. Let me just, before EJ comes out, let me just read a few words, a couple of pages, in order to get the discussion going from the very beginning, the introduction to the book. And this is what I wrote. When we began our race for the presidency in April 2015, we were considered by the political establishment and the media to be a fringe campaign, something not to be taken seriously. After all, I was a senator from a small state with very little name recognition. Our campaign had no money, no political organization, and we were taking on the entire Democratic Party establishment. And by the way, we were also running against the most powerful political operation in the country. The Clinton machine had won the presidency for Bill Clinton twice and almost won the Democratic presidential nomination for Hillary Clinton in 2008. When our campaign finally came to a close in July 2016, it turned out that the pundits had got it wrong, big time. We had made history and run one of the most consequential campaigns in the modern history of the country, a campaign that would, in a very profound way, change America. We received more than 13 million votes in primaries and caucuses throughout the country. We won 22 states, more than a few by landslide proportions. We won 1,846 pledged delegates to the Democratic Convention, 46% of the total. Importantly, in virtually every state, we won a strong majority of younger people, the future of America. We won large percentages of the vote from white, Black, Latino, Asian American, and Native American youth. We set the agenda for the America of tomorrow. Thank you.
I love you too. It's great to be here tonight. A real honor to be at GW and with Senator Sanders, and also at an event organized by Politics and Prose, which isn't just a bookstore, but a great institution in this city. It is, you might say, if you're in a Bernie Sanders crowd, a community organization. And what they do to organize public discussion and public debate is extraordinary, and I am just very happy to be here for that. But this is a grave and serious moment, and I'll get to this. Senator Sanders, in his book, has really nice things to say about the media, about its tendency to...
He's kidding.
And its tendency to focus on side issues. But precisely because it's a grave moment, and because you have written this book, Senator, there are a few moments at the beginning of the book about yourself that that I didn't know, and that I think people in the audience, as they approach the book, might be interested in knowing. I did not know, for example, that the Boy Scouts made your political career possible, in a manner of speaking. And I just love you. I want to ask just a couple of things about your early life. The Boy Scout story is quite wonderful. For every student athlete, I want you to know that Bernie Sanders got cut from his high school basketball team. They were obviously influenced by the corporate media, that coach. But you went on to become a track star, a runner, and I was curious, and with this you have in common with President Obama. You're a democratic socialist, but you are a very competitive person. And I'd like you to talk about sort of those two experiences, and I have one other early life experience before we get to the other questions. And by the way, thank you all. I went through hundreds of questions back there. You've asked excellent questions. I've tried to lump some of them together in categories, and there are some I'll ask specifically. But the Boy Scouts, basketball, running, and sports.
I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. Some of you have heard of Brooklyn. And I grew up in a lower middle class neighborhood. I lived in a rent-controlled apartment. Our family did not have a whole lot of money. And what I mentioned in the book, which I think had a profound impact on me, and this is one way the world has changed, not necessarily, I think, for the better. When we were kids, EJ, what we would do is we go out into the street or into the schoolyards, and we would play ball from morning to night. And we did it all ourselves. We didn't have any coaches. We didn't have any referees. We worked it all out. And and as I think about it in retrospect, it turns out to have been a very democratic approach. Everybody knew. You couldn't bullshit anybody else. You knew if you were the best ball player or the third best. Everybody knew it. There was no argument about that. And we worked it out whether you were safe at second base or not, who brought the bat, who brought the ball, whether we were going to play football or punchball or baseball. It was a means of young people without adult supervision working out things so that they can play actively and fairly, choose up their teams, decide who wins or loses. If we're playing basketball and it's a three-man game, my team beats your team quietly goes to the side, another team comes on, they beat me, we go off to the side. Everybody understood the rules. It was really interesting. It was very much a democratic approach to how we do things. Now, what happened is our family didn't have a lot of money, and in the summertime, my parents would send my brother and me, or him early, he was older, to Boy Scout camp, 10 Mile River Boy Scout camp in Narrowsburg, New York. And we went up there, and I said, my God, look at this. This is the country. There are stars in the night. Who knew that? And we slept in lean-tos, which were small structures without any doors. The mattresses that we have were literally hay put into sheets. It was a pretty primitive way of living, but I loved it. I really did. That was my first introduction to rural life and certainly influenced my decision early on to move to the state of Vermont.
By the way, Senator Sanders still remembers, I quote the book, I ran the mile in 4:37, fast enough for third place in the New York City Indoor Mile Championship. There's later in the book, you talk about a group of organizations you joined when you were in college, and you talk about YPSL, the Young People's Socialist League, the Student Peace Union, and the Congress of Racial Equality. In the book, you don't actually talk about why you joined the Young People's Socialist League. What was it about democratic socialism at that moment when most Americans did not think of themselves as democratic socialists? I guess not that many do now, but more than then. What made you join YPSL?
Well, you know, you're asking a very profound question of which I can't answer. That is, you're really asking, how do we turn out the way we turn out, and why do we become the people we become? Ever since I was a little kid, I really did not like to see bullies. I didn't like to see, stronger kids picking on weaker kids. I didn't like, discrimination, and I didn't like that. I didn't like power plays on the part of people who had the power. But that was just kind of instinctual. And, as a kid, I felt strongly about racism and poverty. And when I went to the University of Chicago, I was not a good student, but what I did do was spend an enormous amount of time down in what they call the stacks of the library. It was a very good library, and I would bury myself in there, reading everything that I could read about history and politics and sociology and economics and psychology. I did a whole lot of reading. I was was not a good student, let's say that. But I did a whole lot of reading. But what the Young People's Socialist League did to me, it helped me put two and two together in my mind. In other words, we don't like poverty, we don't like racism, we don't like war, we don't like exploitation. What do they all have in common? And people say, well, I'm against poverty, but why, for example, at a time when we are the wealthiest country in the history of the world, why do we have 43 million people living in poverty? Why do we have such an unfair distribution of wealth and income? What does wealth and power mean? How does it influence politics? Money always played a dominant role, a very important role in who gets elected. Now, as a result of Citizens United, it is far worse. Who decided that World War I would take place? Who even knows why we went to war in World War I? What was that about? Who makes these decisions? So what my studies tried to do is put two and two and two together. And that is why, I kind of evolved to an analysis which tries to explain to me what goes on in the world today and then.
One other thing that I noticed in the book in personal terms is you come back to clothing a number of times. And one of the first crisis you faced when you were elected mayor of Burlington, and I quote, was purchasing clothing suitable to the mayor. At the time, I didn't own a suit, just one or two corduroy sports jackets and a few ties. It wasn't my intention to become the best-dressed mayor in America, or even to wear a tie all that often. I thought, however, that a little sprucing up wouldn't hurt. Overnight, my wardrobe doubled in size.
You know, and I also said that's absolutely true, as the people of Burlington, Vermont will attest to. But what's also true is a few years ago, I had the distinction of being named by some inside the Beltway magazine here to be the worst dressed member of the United States Senate. And all, thank you. And all I can say, if you think I am badly dressed now,
let me, I like button-down shirts myself. Let me move to the political a little bit, and this will move us to the questions. When you talk in the book about thinking of running for president, you have some interesting things to say about Mrs. Clinton. On the one side, you talk about an experience you had with her explaining her health care program, and you write she knew that plan backward and forward. She also answered questions flawlessly. 25 years later, this is when President Clinton was trying to pass health care reform. 25 years later, I still marvel at that performance. Yet you also are very critical of her on the same page. The Clinton approach was to try to merge the interests of Wall Street and corporate America with the needs of the American middle class, an impossible task. While the Clinton administration can boast some positive accomplishments, I supported Bill Clinton. There were major policy flaws. Tell me about, after this is all over, what is your attitude toward the Clintons, toward the politics, and toward Mrs. Clinton in the end of this campaign?
The section of the book you referred to was an event that I went to at Dartmouth Medical School. And I was then in the Congress, and Hillary Clinton was First Lady and leading Bill Clinton's effort, the administration's effort for health care reform. And I was able to hitch a ride on Air Force Two with her, and we chatted for a while, and we went to Dartmouth, because Dartmouth is only across the river from Vermont. And what blew me away is she got up there, and I'm guessing now, it was a long time ago, but maybe for an hour, she spoke without any notes whatsoever, not a note, on an enormously complicated program, which was their health care approach, which was too complicated. But she knew it all. My point was that she was not just the front person for the Clinton health care plan. She had helped write it. She really knew it. She answered questions flawlessly. And this tells me that we have an extraordinarily intelligent person. And that was the memory then. And that hasn't changed. I have a lot of respect for Hillary Clinton. We've known each other for 25 years. Got to know each other, for better or worse, a little bit more in the last year and a half. And she's a very impressive, and I like her a lot. On the other hand, what is very clear is her politics and Bill Clinton's politics are very different than mine in terms of their policy views and in terms of their understanding of how you change America. In terms of policy, it was the Clinton administration that brought forth NAFTA, and I suspect if a Democrat had not been president at that time, NAFTA would not have passed. And I think that was the beginning of a series of disastrous trade agreements done at the behest of the corporate world. Big money wanted these trade agreements. They wrote these trade agreements. It was the Clinton administration that brought about the deregulation of Wall Street, led by Robert Rubin, formerly from Citibank, I think at that point. Wall Street, major Wall Street force. And the point that I'm making is I happen to believe that at the end of the day, politically, you have to make a decision. And this is really the debate that we're going to have within the Democratic Party right now. And that debate is, which side are you on? Can you go out and raise substantial sums of money from the wealthy and Wall Street and other powerful special interests and then convince the American people that you are on the side of workers and the middle class? Or do you finally have to say that we are going to take on the oligarchs, we are going to take on Wall Street and the drug companies and the insurance companies and the corporate media, and that we are going to bring millions of working people together to create a very different type of party, Democratic Party, than currently exists? And that is a fundamental difference that exists between Bill and Hillary Clinton and myself.
I was going to ask you the next question later, but let me just put it to you now. Well, looking through the hundreds of questions, there were a number of people in the audience who basically talked about how the Democratic Party had treated you unfairly. What were you going to do about that? What was going to happen to the party? And when some Clinton supporters, just people who knew I was doing this, they wanted me to ask you in a rather pointed way, do you think that what you did in the primaries hurt Hillary Clinton? I'm sure you saw it and didn't like it. The distinguished scholar Theda Skocpol's letter in the New York Times, where she talked about your told you so message that you're giving. Now, I'll just quote her, Mr. Sanders' refusal to concede in a timely way, as Hillary Clinton won many million more votes, his constant harping that she was corrupt furthered Mr. Trump's message and contributed to the con man's catastrophic victory. What do you say to those critics?
Well, I say to those critics, number one, that you could argue the exact reverse, that maybe I would have been elected president of the United States. But the presumption behind that question is that I guess we should anoint candidates for president, that a serious debate or candidates competing against each other is somehow a bad thing for democracy. The truth is, EJ, my campaign brought millions of people into the political process, many of whom I suspect the overwhelming majority of whom ended up voting for Hillary Clinton. All right? But the second point, dealing with the first part of the question, I think many people have read some of the Wikipedia, the Podesta emails that were released. And, if you read those emails, I think you learn that, to say the very least, the DNC was not a neutral force in the campaign. That's to say the least. And that we had to take on, and I'm proud of this, we had to take on virtually the entire Democratic establishment. So, do I think our campaign, in a sense, made Hillary Clinton a better candidate? Yeah, I do. And I'll tell you why. Because by the end of the campaign, she was against the Keystone Pipeline. By the end of the campaign, she was against the TPP. By the end of the campaign, she was supporting making public colleges and universities tuition-free. And I think those and other ideas that we incorporated into the Democratic platform, which is the most progressive party platform in the history of this country, I think all of that, in fact, made Hillary Clinton a stronger candidate.
By the way, I don't think the Skocpol letter was saying you shouldn't have run. It was a critique of what you did after the votes were counted, after California.
Apparently, people thought that people in California and 4 other states on June 7th should not have a right to determine who they wanted to see as the Democratic nominee.
I'm talking about after California.
No, after California, this was my approach. My approach was to say I am fully prepared to support Hillary Clinton. And by the way, very few people in this country worked harder for Hillary Clinton than I did. So let's be clear about that. But what I was also determined to do is to say to Secretary Clinton, okay, we got 13.4 million votes. Obviously, you want those votes. I understand that. And I want you to have those votes. But you know what? I want you to speak to what many of those people told me during the campaign. They want to make public colleges and universities tuition-free. They want to expand health care. They want you to be a more progressive candidate. And that, in fact, ended up happening, and I think that was an asset and a positive thing for Secretary Clinton's campaign.
There were a number of questions about the media, and I will just read a paragraph from your book. According to a study of media coverage of the 2016 primaries by the Shorenstein Center on Media Politics and Public Policy, only 11% of coverage focused on candidates' policy positions, leadership abilities, and professional histories. I find that hard to believe. My personal sense is that number is much too high. A couple of things on that. Talk about your critique of the corporate media, and how does that fit in with the fact that Donald Trump has been waging a campaign on the media as allegedly liberal and is clearly trying to discredit, if you will, factually oriented media? How does your critique fit with Trump's critique?
Okay. Well, it doesn't fit at all.
I thought you might say that, but...
But here is the issue. It is, in fact, I think the title of the chapter is The Corporate Media, a Threat to Our Democracy. This is serious stuff, and it is all the more serious because you're not going to see it discussed on television. It's not going to be. And it's not going to be in most newspapers. But here's what you got. You have approximately 6 major media conglomerates, Time Warner, et cetera, who now control about 90% of the what we call media, which means that a handful of giant conglomerates exercise enormous power over what the American people see, hear, and read. And we have got to disabuse ourselves of the idea that NBC and CBS and CNN and Fox and all these guys, they're objective. They're kind of referees. They're going to give both sides of the story. The function of corporate media, and I hope I don't shock anybody, is to make money. That is their job. They are a business. They make money. And in fact, somebody like a Donald Trump, and EJ, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure you're familiar with this, I think the head of CBS and CNN both said Trump was great for them. He was outrageous. He said outrageous things. Their ratings went up. Put them on again. Every time you turn on the television, there's Donald Trump saying something outrageous, attacking somebody. Great TV. Now, we had the misfortune of not being a campaign which believed that we should viciously attack our opponent. Okay? And I try to run as positive a campaign as I could. And I also believe that a campaign and what democracy is about is taking a hard look at the real issues facing the country and offering solutions to those problems. Problem is, I could not do that in 3 seconds. And problem is, that is not what media is interested in, getting back to what EJ just read. And what he read is that study after study tells us most of television coverage is attacks, all right? And that works very well for television. How much discussion, and this blew me away, and this is in the book. I quoted some guy who did a study. And this is what the study said. Study said they looked at television over a period of time, and they wanted to see how much discussion there was of poverty on television. I think it was the evening news, or Sunday news shows, I can't remember. Turns out that 2/3 of the entire discussion of poverty was based on things that I said. Now, that is pretty pathetic, that one candidate does 2/3 of the discussion about one of the most important issues facing this country. Do you know how much discussion there is about climate change on the evening news? Virtually none. Do you know how much discussion there is about comparing the American healthcare system to what goes on around the rest of the industrialized world, where every country on earth guarantees healthcare to all people? Virtually none. So the point about my critique was not that, media hates me and all that stuff. That wasn't the point. The point was that in a democracy, we need serious discussion about serious issues, and that is not what the corporate media is giving us. Now, Trump's problem is what the media was discovering is that he was a pathological liar. And I don't say that. I'm not into, I really don't. I have many Republican friends, and we disagree. But every day, this guy would say something that was completely off the wall. He was the only person in America who saw on television Muslims celebrating the destruction of the Twin Towers. Nobody else in America saw that on television except Donald Trump. And he was absolutely convinced that he saw that. And on it goes. And the media had a hard time because they were trying to say, well, that's not quite true. And he would take offense to that. That's a very different critique than my feelings.
I'm looking for a question that someone asked to follow up on that, which was something like, what in the heck happened? Or a third grader in the audience asked, then, I add the then, why?
You were like, okay, but it's so beautiful, and I know she was excited. But also, when you're in a museum, never put your hands on the artwork.
That's a smart one.
But a lot of people don't know that, because sometimes, where we went to Napoleon's apartments.
Yes.
You think you could sit down on furniture? You can't. Don't sit down on that furniture.
Yeah.
It might fall apart because it's so old.
Should be able to give directly, not independent expenditures. That if you want to run for office, the Koch brothers will come up to you and say, E.J., here is $1 billion. We're going to support your campaign for presidency, and we will give you your staff. You work for us. You're essentially a paid employee of the Koch brothers. Now, we got to figure out. That's number one. And number two, we got to deal with the Republican effort at voter suppression all over this country. I just spoke with Jesse Jackson today, and he is deeply concerned about what's going on in North Carolina and elsewhere, where very intentional efforts, as you all know, designed by Republican governors and attorney general to make it harder for people of color, for poor people, for young people, or old people to vote. So we got a lot of work on our hands, let me tell you. I mean, this is not easy stuff, and it's not good enough for people to say, well, gee, I went to a demonstration yesterday, the world didn't change, I'm giving up. That's not the way it happens. Put yourself into an historical context. Think about the struggles 100+ years ago that workers went through in order to gain dignity on the job and to form unions. Think about what women went through for a very long period of time in order to get the right to vote, in order to get the right to have an education or the job that they wanted. Some of those women died in the struggle. Some went on hunger strikes. Some ended up in jail. Think about the struggles of the gay community. How many decades and decades they fought with their straight allies in order to make sure that people had the right to marry someone regardless of their gender. Change does not come easily. We are in a struggle. And we are in a struggle against very, very powerful people who want it all. That's the bad news. The good news is there are a hell of a lot more of us than there are of them. And we got to be smart and figure that out.
There were two questions in the pack that I thought a lot of people in the audience might be interested in hearing you answer. One from Will was, what did you think of Larry David and how he played you on Saturday Night Live? And the other is from Elizabeth, who asked, if you were stuck on a desert island with 3 politicians, who would you pick? That begs the question of whether you'd want to be stuck on a desert island with 3 politicians. Larry David in that question.
EJ, I got to tell you this. I am Larry David. And I fooled you, didn't I, huh? Sanders is back in Vermont, and I'm here, and you fell for it. No.
I've always wanted to meet Larry David. I'd only met Bernie Sanders.
I had the, and I'll tell you something else about television, go on Saturday Night Live, and suddenly a lot of people know you who didn't know you before, I'll tell you that. Larry David is a brilliant comedian. He's a brilliant guy, and it's a little bit scary watching him do me. He does me better than I do me, so it's, you know, in terms of the second question, one of the, before I ran for mayor of Burlington, I did a video, and what I wanted to do, and I would have done probably in my life if I hadn't gotten elected mayor, was to try to talk about political figures in our history who've kind of been wiped out of history, who you know, the media doesn't talk about very much. And there's some extraordinary people throughout our history who have done remarkable, courageous things that we don't know about. And I did a video about one of the great people in American history. His name was Eugene V. Debs. Now, I would be surprised if 10% of the American people knew who Debs was. And yet Debs was one of the original great leaders of the American working class, helped form the American Railway Union, brought together a lot of disparate unions into one large union. In fact, developed a program along with the Socialist Party of his time. He ran for president on the Socialist Party 6 times, including once from a jail cell because he opposed World War I. And he was sent to jail, and he got 1 million votes from a jail cell. So I think, you know, from an historical perspective, he was an extraordinary man, and I would not mind spending some time with him on an island someplace, preferably a warm island. But the other person that I think everyone has heard of, but doesn't really fully appreciate his strength and his genius, is Martin Luther King Jr. What the media has done with King over the years is to say, well, this guy was a brave guy, he was a great guy, he helped break down segregation in the South, helped bring the Voting Rights Act, and he was just really, really great. What they do not tell you, and what they kind of try to erase from history, is I hope all of you know that when King was assassinated, he was not on a quote-unquote civil rights demonstration. He was out helping garbage workers in Memphis, Tennessee, who were really working for terrible wages and terrible working conditions. He was also in the process of forming and putting together a poor people's march, which was blacks and whites and Native Americans and Latinos, poor people, demanding changes in national priorities. Instead of spending unlimited sums of money on the military, making sure that people had health care and educational opportunities. Point that I'm trying to make here is if you read King's life, you understand that he was extraordinarily courageous in standing up to the establishment. What the establishment wanted from him is, you're a great civil rights leader. And he said, thank you, but no thank you. I'm going to oppose the war in Vietnam. Boy, did they not want to hear that. And then he said, you know what? I think we need to change our national priorities. We need to take on the wealthy and the powerful. They did not want to hear that as well. So this was a man of great courage and magnitude, also somebody I wouldn't mind spending time with on a desert island.
What did you make of the Russian intervention in this election and the FBI intervention? And it's odd to put those two together, isn't it? But
It is, and you know, I don't want to speak about more than I know. I mean, I think I can simply say that I believe what Hillary Clinton said the other day is true. I think that effort hurt her at the end of the campaign, no question about it. It hurt her once, then it hurt her twice. When a few days before the election day, they decided that there was nothing new in the emails that they had perused. It is this whole situation now of cybersecurity. I mean, what the Russians, we think, have done raises this unbelievable issue of whether or not anything we have online is in fact private and secure. I mean, that's just an extraordinary thought. You think about your medical records, your banking records, every damn email that you have sent out. Can somebody access it? And we're beginning to think, yes, that is the case, which makes me think, above and beyond Russia, that we really need legislation to catch up with this exploding technology to ensure privacy for the American people.
Two other issue questions that came up a lot from this very issue-oriented crowd. One were not surprising, neither is surprising actually. One was what can be done about the Electoral College and also about gerrymandering, those came up. And then the other is how can Obamacare be defended and ultimately expanded? And that was the theme of a whole lot of the questions that came in.
Well, let me start with the second. And this again, you know, I know some of my Democratic friends will be in disagreement with me. I voted for the Affordable Care Act, so-called Obamacare, and it got some major provisions in there which greatly expanded community health centers for many, many millions of people. But at the end of the day, what we have to say is that the question that we have to ask ourselves on health care is a pretty simple question. How does it happen that we are the only major country on earth not to guarantee health care to all people as a right? How does it happen that despite 28 million people having no health insurance and many others being underinsured, we end up spending far, far more per capita on health care? And how does it happen that our health care outcomes are not, in many cases, better than other countries? In other words, we have a health care system which is basically dysfunctional. And I happen to believe we need to move toward a Medicare for all single-payer program. In terms of the Electoral College, as we all know, Electoral College. Hillary Clinton got, we think at the end of the day, maybe 2 million more votes than Mr. Trump, but she's not going to be the president of the United States. On the surface, that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense in a democratic society. But on top of that, you got the absurdity, and you know, I can tell you firsthand, that this entire campaign was played out in 15 or 16 states. All right, so the assumption is, let's say California and Vermont are Democratic, no one has to worry about that. Wyoming and South Dakota are Republican, no one has to worry about that. We don't have to pay attention to the needs of the people in those states. So people in Wyoming don't get any candidates coming there. People in Vermont don't get any candidates coming there. California, the largest state in this country, is ignored politically. Their needs, their problems are ignored. So I think we have to rethink the whole Electoral College. We should not have a campaign where 2/3 of the states in this country are ignored. Every vote matters. The vote in California, the vote in Wyoming. Candidates for president should have to go after every one of those votes. I think that would create a better democracy than what we have right now.
EJ, EJ.
I'm going to ask the last question.
Oh, two more. You have two more. I'm sorry to be the bearer, but we could go on forever. We have time for two more questions, so two more.
Oh, I'll just give the last one.
Okay. Whatever. You're in charge.
Just knowing, I'm going to ask one question from the pack and one question of my own. The question of my own is, it goes back to what we've hit on all the way through here. I personally, speaking for myself, think it's more important than ever that every one of you stays engaged in politics. We really need you now. Sort of short term, I want you to give people advice about how to act between now and the inauguration and how to build a lasting movement. And then given the tenor of this particular crowd, I thought I had to ask this last question, which is, are you going to run in 2020?
I think that after what appeared to be a never-ending campaign in 2016, the last thing the American people are worried about now is who's going to run in 2020.
It's right here on this card.
I know. But the first question is the more important one, as what do we do? And this is what I think we do. We make it clear that as a people, we will not accept for 1 second bigotry of any kind, racism, sexism, Islamophobia, xenophobia. We are not going to sit by while a handful of people in the White House decide to destroy families and deport millions of people. We are not going to sit by and allow those things to happen. The second thing that I think we have got to do is on issues like rebuilding a crumbling middle class, dealing with climate change and transforming our energy system. We have got to mobilize people around progressive politics. And here is the good news. The good news right now is that the vast majority of the American people, not the Republican leadership in Congress, but the vast majority of the American people believe we should raise the minimum wage to a living wage. And when we mobilize millions of people to make the White House and the leadership in the House and the Senate understand that, it becomes at their peril to ignore that reality. Climate change is a tougher issue because, in fact, Trump campaigned in opposition to transforming our energy system. But this is an issue that we are just going to have to mobilize like crazy because, let me say this, in my view, the future of the planet is at stake, and we must transform our energy system.
Thank you, Senator Sanders, and thanks to this extraordinary crowd. Never surrender to indifference and never surrender to fear. Thank you all for being here tonight.
C-SPAN's Washington Journal live every day with news and policy issues that impact you. This week, we're focusing on members of Congress and their reaction to Donald Trump's presidential win. Coming up this morning,